Welcome to today's video conference with Bay Area Ethnic and Community Media. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services, and your moderator for today's briefing. Our topic is small landlords and their struggle to stay afloat during the pandemic. While public attention focuses on the eviction crisis facing millions of tenants who've lost jobs and can't pay their rent, there's little public information about how the country's 8 million independent landlords are managing. 77%, that's 77% of these landlords are small landlords called mom and pop landlords. And it's their 2, 4, and multiplex apartment units that form the backbone of the low rental housing market. In the Bay Area, small landlords of color are struggling to pay their mortgages, with Asian, Latinx, and Black homeowners facing elevated risks of mortgage delinquency. We're pleased to have 4 presenters to address this topic, to explain why small landlords need additional help from policymakers if they are to survive, and the stakes for the low rent housing market in their survival. Our first speaker is John Yen Wong, founding chairman of the Asian Real Estate Association of America, or AREA, who calls small landlords not landlords, but housing providers. Our second speaker is Jung Byun Choi, a senior research associate with the Housing Finance Policy Center of the Urban Institute, who has studied the financial stress small landlords face nationwide. Our third speaker is Maeva Elise Brown, Director of Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, or HERA, whose agency has provided legal representation for both tenants and small landlords for many years. And our fourth speaker is Ji Wong, an East Bay landlord who has agreed to share her story with us. We will send extended bios and contact information about our speakers, along with a video of the conference, to all participants this afternoon. We can also provide contacts for reporters with other landlords who've agreed to be interviewed. We ask reporters to enter questions in the chat box, and I will moderate questions after each speaker as time allows. Our thanks to the James Irvine Foundation for its support of EMS's work on the affordable housing crisis, and to Maeva Brown for her help in planning today's briefing. Now we will begin with our first speaker, Mr. Wong, co-founder and director of the Asian Real Estate Association of America. Mr. Wong, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It is indeed an honor to be part of this panel addressing really a circumstance that is near and dear to my heart. I mean, a little bit of personal background. I've lived in San Francisco for 66 and a half of the 67 years of my life. And my family grew up in Chinatown as tenants. And over time, we eventually were able to move into the Mission District as a tenant. And ultimately, my parents, in their mid-50s, finally were able to purchase their own home in the Richmond District of San Francisco. I have been a realtor for now over 40 years, and have owned some small properties myself and have that experience of both being a housing provider as well as a tenant. And so really in context, the things that I would like to talk about today is really what a mom and pop landlord is. What are some of the struggles that have historically been a challenge? but maybe as important, some of the things that have happened because of COVID-19. So the story of a mom and pop landlord typically follows this path, and it's not dissimilar to my own. First, I was a tenant. I scrimped and saved to the point where we could purchase our first home. And the first home, you're very happy with it. At some point, you may have leveraged enough savings to purchase a second property. It is not uncommon for property owners from underserved communities, minority communities, to not sell that first home if they're able to purchase the second home without selling it and start generating some income from it. So it becomes the first income property. And the relationship that that individual as a housing provider has with the tenants who live in that property is usually a very amicable one. Because at that time, that individual spends their own time and resources to maintain the property. They get to know the individuals personally very well. Over time, they may be able to acquire a second property which can generate income. And eventually, they may have friends get together and buy as a group a few more properties. So what you have as a relationship, the underlying theme is that, in fact, these owners, these housing providers, actually know the people who live in the units of the properties they own personally. Maybe not intimately, but at least personally. They understand when there are the families are growing, they understand where some of the family members may go to school. And so it's an amicable business relationship. Now, there are other types of large rental property providers, and these have grown a lot recently, in particular because of the downturn during the foreclosure crisis, where the property values throughout the state were crashing so quickly that ultimately Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two holders of a lot of these mortgages, in fact, invited hedge funds to come in and buy large swaths of rental properties. Those of us who are in the industry found this to be a good thing because it at least put a bottom on a crashing market. We all thought that these groups would not want to keep these properties forever, would ultimately sell them off to other small mom and pop owners who would buy them. But what has happened is a lot of these groups have found that they've been able, through technology, to manage the operation of these rental properties that have held on to them. So I talk about this sort of spectrum of housing providers because I think it speaks to our response to COVID. As I mentioned, the relationships have typically been very, very amicable. And even if this disparity in wealth in communities has been exacerbated over the last few years, generally smaller property owners still know the folks who rent from them. And then COVID-19 happened. And when COVID-19 happened, all of a sudden, many of us could no longer work. Because we couldn't work, there was no income. For a lot of the smaller folks who lived in rental properties, they may not have qualified for unemployment because in fact they were considered essential workers, had worked in restaurants or grocery stores and would continue working, but still the hours were more restricted and the revenue was restricted. And so an emergency bill was passed, and appropriately so. It was Assembly Bill 3088, which was called the COVID-19 Tenant Relief Act of 2020. And what it basically look, through no fault of the folks who are living in these rental units, they're unable to pay their rent. So let's put a moratorium on evictions for anybody who could not pay rent from March 1st, 2020 through January 31st, 2021, if the reason they couldn't pay rent was due to COVID-19. And this is, on the face of it, very reasonable because these individuals are unable to pay their rent because they're unable to generate revenue because of a black swan pandemic. It wasn't through any fault of their own. In the beginning, there was unfortunately very little awareness of the plight of the housing providers whom the rent was paid to, whom they could no longer receive them. And the challenge was, while they were unable to ask a tenant to leave because they weren't paying the rent, they still had to pay their mortgage. They still had to pay for the insurance bills, the utilities, all the costs of operations of keeping the properties healthy and manageable for the folks who live in. Then a further component of this bill was that starting September 1st, 2020, through January 31st, 2021, a tenant was responsible for 25% of the rent they owed. It was a recognition the resources weren't there to pay 100%, but at least 25% of it must be paid. And it didn't have to be paid immediately. It was a recognition that the resources weren't there, but it would be an amount that would be accruing down time. And that January 31st, 2021, ideally in those early days, we thought everything would be finished and the COVID would be resolved, and they would work out some sort of agreement with the housing provider to have the rental paid. Now, there was still not to be any type of unlawful detainer, which is another word for eviction, for any rent that couldn't be paid through January 3rd, 2021, if it was COVID related. So this was kind of the framework that we were approaching toward as we went to the end of 2020, because the reality is if the amounts, even at 25%, was being accrued, and it was being accrued for almost 9 months, it would be a significant amount that even if COVID were totally resolved and everybody was back to work, the resources to make that sort of payment was very, very slim. So the real estate professionals, of which I am one, I am with the Asian Real Estate Association of America, as Sandy had mentioned, but I'm also active with the National Association of Realtors, the California Association of Realtors. And the advocacy efforts in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento was to have some resources to help the small property owners. It was really to help all property owners, all housing providers, but with special emphasis on the smaller mom and pops, because those are the ones who had the fewest resources to kind of maintain their properties as compared to the larger operations like the hedge funds. And so Senate Bill 91 was passed it was really early February where it came into effect. But what it did was did two things. One, it extended the moratorium from evictions to June 30th, 2021. So it added an additional 6 months to the eviction moratorium. But the other side of it was it had a rental assistance program. It had $1.6 billion that were from the federal government that could then be distributed out to housing providers. And the administration of this was to be handled through a state agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. And many of us who are in the industry and tenants groups had conversations with the HCD and how to develop the distribution method. The eligibility for those who are on this call will be first focused on properties that had households, the tenants, who made less than 50% of the area median income. In other words, it was focused on helping those who had greatest need. It also had a second focus on communities that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And there is a correlation that many of these communities are of ethnic minority communities, maybe more densely urban populations, et cetera. And then the next group to be addressed would be households who made under 80% of the area median income, which comes closer to, let's say, perhaps a teacher or those in the working segment. So there are funds that are now available. I personally have heavy focus on making sure that individuals who have English as not their primary language have access to information, that these funds are available. That's why this particular panel is particularly meaningful for me, because it's a way to get information out to those who may not know about it. And my heavy focus is to make sure that the individuals in these communities have access to these funds, because it's usually the larger entities that may have the resources and knowledge to sort of grab the money faster, or maybe grab's wrong characterization, to be able to apply and access the money faster. And as much, even the billions of dollars that are available for this, they will be used up very quickly. So the SB 91 moratorium and the state rental assistance program, in my opinion, is the most important thing to have for smaller mom and pop housing providers. And I'm happy to at least alert this. And if there are folks who want further information, Sandra will give my contact and I'll give a little more detailed information than I can in these 8 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Wong, for that very helpful historical overview and for the focus on the current policy benefits available. I'm going to go directly to our next speaker and hold off questions until the end, because I think there's a real flow of information here, and we'll get questions. Each speaker will help us focus on the questions we need. So let me go next to Ms. Choi from the Urban Institute. Thank you for joining us.
Great, thanks for the invitation. Okay, so here today I'm gonna talk about the small rental units, especially focusing on mom and pop landlords. Just a brief overview. The small rental units, especially 1 to 4 properties, currently account for about half of the rental stocks in the US. There is about 2.3 million properties. In this space, disproportionately greater share of those who live in small rental units, especially 2 to 4 units, are low-income households and households of color. We also know that renters, especially renters of color, has been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 pandemic. And in this space, about 75% of units are owned by individual investors. And these landlords are more likely to be landlords of color, and they're also more likely to own 2 to 4 rental units. So there are a lack of data in this space. So we were very, very fortunate to partner with Avail, which is an online platform that helps do-it-yourself mom and pop landlords manage their rental units and collect rents for about 53,000 properties nationwide. Avail provides monthly rental payment information from its administrative data, and also conducts periodic surveys to both their landlords and tenants. So we were able to participate in designing questions for 3 of its previous surveys. And in the most recent survey, we find that about 36% of tenants were Black and 10% were Hispanic. Among the landlords, 14% were Black and 9% were Hispanic. About 89% of landlords own 1 to 4 unit properties in Avail data, and 66% of tenants live in these property types. So first, let's look at the rental payment over time. So this shows, the graph on the left shows the monthly rental payment in the US over time. So you see that there has been a drop between March 2020 and April 2020 due to the pandemic. There has been a slow recovery due to the drop in the unemployment rate, as well as the dispersion of UI benefit But in the national space, you do see that since November, the numbers have gone down. And the most recent month, which is February 2021, about 86% of landlords living in small multifamily rental units in the Vail data have paid their rent on time. The numbers are slightly better in California. We see that about 91% of tenants have paid their rent on time. Again, we do see a drop between March and April, and the number has recovered since then. So in the first survey, which was conducted in August 2020, we wanted to know how the mom and pop landlords were doing in terms of making their mortgage payments. So first here shows that among the total landlords in the survey, 58% said they were not facing any trouble making mortgage payment. That number was slightly lower for landlords in California. About 55% said they were not facing any trouble making their mortgage payments. We do see that there are disparities across race and ethnic groups. About 66% of white landlords said that they're not facing any trouble paying their mortgage, compared to 47% of Black and Hispanic landlords. And there are several reasons why Black and Hispanic landlords are facing greater trouble making their mortgage payment. So we looked at them specifically. So first, we find that Black and Hispanic landlords are more likely to have lower income. The share of landlords who have less than $75,000 of income were higher for Blacks and Hispanic landlords. They're also more likely to own only one property. About 40% of Black landlords and 47% of Hispanic landlords said that they only own one property, which means that it's more difficult for them to diversify risk. And Black and Hispanic landlords, compared to the white landlords, were more likely to have a mortgage attached to the property. So with this, we wanted to know what actions landlords and mom and pop landlords take when they face challenges making their mortgage payment. First, we look at forbearance. We do see that Black and Hispanic landlords are more likely to have a mortgage in forbearance. About 20% of Black landlords said that they have at least one mortgage in forbearance, and 14% of Hispanic landlords said that they have at least one mortgage in forbearance. That number was higher compared to white, who said they about 9% of white said that they have at least one mortgage in forbearance. California, the share of landlords, mom and pop landlords who have at least one mortgage in forbearance were lower compared to the whole nation. Next, we also find that landlords of color are more likely to offer rent payment options to their tenants. So Black and Hispanic landlords, compared to the white landlords, were more likely to offer this option to their tenants. So what I also want to highlight here is that if you remember the previous slide, the share of landlords not facing any trouble making the mortgage was actually the same for Black and...
Ms. Choi, could you speak a little slower for the interpreter?
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm kind of cautious of time because I only have 8 minutes, but I'll try to slow down.
Okay, no problem. But one other question that a lot of the media is asking is, do you have Asian or API data?
So Asian data, we do have that data, and I can send it along after the presentation. The only reason I'm not showing it here is that the sample size is relatively smaller for Asian population in their survey, so we didn't really do much analysis using that data, but we do have some numbers. So if you're interested, I can send it along after the presentation.
Definitely, maybe if you could even enter it in the chat box, or if not, we will send it with the video after the briefing is over. But please go on, because this is very important data.
Yes, thank you. So what you find, if you compare Blacks and Hispanics, you kind of see that Blacks are more likely to enter forbearance, while Hispanics are more likely to offer rental payment options to the tenants. Next, in the October survey, we wanted to know whether mom and pop landlords are facing greater challenges to sell their properties amidst the pandemics and are tightening their credit, tightening their screening. So in the left figure, among the total landlords, about 30% of landlords said that they have tightened their credit since the pandemic, compared to about 33% of landlords in California. And we clearly see that the numbers are varies across incomes and across landlords who have mortgages and who doesn't have mortgages. So we find that those with mortgages are more likely to experience increased pressure to sell amidst the pandemic compared to those without mortgages. And the share of landlords experiencing increased pressure to sell decreases with the landlord's level of income. So as I explained before, landlords of color are more likely to have a mortgage and have lower income. So this indicates that landlords of color are also experiencing greater pressure to sell their properties amidst the pandemic. Despite these financial challenges, landlords are actually imposing stricter screening process when they're accepting their new tenants because they are afraid that the new tenants will come in and they won't be able to make any rental payment. So again, Black and Hispanic landlords said that they were more likely to impose stricter screening process compared to the white landlords. And we see that number is higher for California landlords compared to the total nation. In the final survey, which was conducted in February, this is, I think, really related to what Mr. Wong presented in his slides. We wanted to know how landlords and tenants were aware of the government rental assistance as well as the extension of eviction moratoria. So let's first look at the awareness of rental assistance. So here we find that among the tenants, about 31% said that they are aware of the government-funded rental assistance. The number were higher for landlords, but it was only still 48%. So only 48% of mom and pop landlords in the Vail survey said that they were aware of government-funded rental assistance. If you look at the California number, the number is slightly lower for the tenants and slightly higher for the landlords. What is more concerning in this space is that for tenants, those who said that they experienced challenges paying rent, they were actually less likely to know about the government-funded rental assistance compared to tenants who said that they did not face any challenges paying their rent. Oppositely, for landlords who said that they experienced loss of rental income, they were more likely to know about the government assistance compared to landlords who did not experience any loss of income. This shows the share of tenants and landlords who said they were eligible, applied, and received rental assistance. About 14% of tenants said that they were eligible, 6% applied, and 1.6% received rental assistance. In the landlord space, about 18% said that they were eligible, 7.5% that said that they applied, and 3.4% said that they received rental assistance. We do see some disparities in the awareness across race and ethnicity, but that difference is small. However, we see greater differences in the application rate and the share of those who received rental assistance. So we find both in the tenant space and the landlord space, Black and Hispanic landlords had greater share of people who said that they applied to government rental assistance and the greater share of those who received rental assistance. This is reflecting the fact that both tenants and landlords of color have been disproportionately hit harder by the current pandemic. These are some of the barriers that landlords and tenants said that they faced when applying for rental assistance. Among landlords, the top 3 answers were first, having to waive evictions during a period of assistance. Second was communicating with tenants. And third was uncertainty about receiving rental assistance payment. In the tenant space, the top 3 answers were first, again, uncertainty about receiving rental assistance payment. Second was finding available rental assistance. And third was complicated eligibility criteria. Finally, I'm gonna show a slide about the awareness of eviction moratoria. Again, we see that significantly lower share of tenants said that they were aware of the extension, CDC's extension of eviction moratoria. In California, the number was slightly lower than 50%. In the nation, it was about 47%. Compared to the tenants, significantly greater share of small mom and pop landlords knew about this extension. In California, about 87% said that they knew about the extension compared to about 84% in the whole nation. Again, we do find a concerning trend that tenants who said that they experienced challenges paying rent were less likely to know about the extension compared to tenants who said they did not have any financial challenges. We see again an opposite trend in the landlord space, showing that landlords who experienced loss of income were more likely to be aware of the extension compared to landlords who did not experience any loss of income. And again, thank you for invitation. I'll look forward to any comments or questions. Thank you. Sandy, I think you're muted.
Go
Okay,
ahead, Sandy.
sorry, if Ms. Choi, if you could, and also Mr. Wong, if you can see questions you can respond to in the chat box while we continue with the presentations, that would be tremendously helpful. Let's go to our third speaker, Maeva Elise Brown of Housing and Economic Rights Advocates. Ms. Brown, we're zooming in now on specifics to the Bay Area.
Great. Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate the first two presentations. I will add what I can. So over the last 2 years in particular, we have been had an uptick through a contract we've had with the City of Oakland and the number of small landlords whom we have been serving, and which has really given us tremendous insight into the who and the what of what's going on. One of the things, so out of that group, out of the last 2 years, out of that part of our clients, and let me back up for a minute, we're a statewide nonprofit law office. We provide free legal services to low and moderate income people across the state of California. We have a broad economic justice and anti-discrimination mission. And so within that, we work on household debt and credit problems. So a lot of what we found, I'm not going to repeat everything that I've just heard, but it's been fascinating to hear that the data in particular from Urban Institute supports, as well as some of the data that Mr. Wong had, it supports what we're seeing on the ground as well. Huge number, majority of people of color approaching us as small landlords for guidance. I'd say over the last 2 years, about 20% have been African American, about 20% Asian, about 35% have been older adults, a lot of older single women, and about 25% Latino. Many properties are self-managed, so small landlords who've never had any training on how to manage property have been going it alone. Consistently below market rate rents was shocking to me, very eye-opening, how low the rents are that consistently are being charged by these small mom and pop housing providers. And I really appreciate Mr. Wong's use of the word housing providers, because that gets really to another key part of the story here, which is our failure to appreciate what small landlords are actually providing. Our failure systemically to recognize that they really are affordable housing providers. Wow. Small landlords as affordable housing providers. That's huge. Policymakers and most advocates don't even think about that or recognize that. Urban's data gathering helps to shine that light in our own experience, helps to shine a light on that. If localities and our state government actually recognized the truth of that, that should have an impact on the policy choices that they make. Because then think about this. This means with the policy choices that the state has made that have just been made no distinction between large landlords and small landlords. The state policy choices have squarely placed the burden of non-payment of rent on the shoulders of small landlords, of a small, affordable housing providers. That our state has endangered our housing stock, our affordable housing stock, by failing to recognize that these small landlords are affordable housing providers. And if they lose their property, they're probably going to lose it to an investor who will charge as much money as the market can possibly bear, and will be much more sophisticated about being able to get that done. I want to also call out the lack of support system that small landlords have. They're in this netherworld. I mean, this is part of why my office serves moderate income people for free, because it really was striking to me as a public interest attorney how if you couldn't squeeze into very, very small low income category, most legal age, if you can't squeeze in there, you won't get any help. And that's because they're funding source that they get. So we don't take that kind of money. We take money that allows us to serve people more broadly. You know, we don't do eviction work, but we do provide information. And small landlords have had so little information. It's, again, very shocking. Here they are, a key source of affordable housing in our state, and they're not connected to virtually any support system. To the extent that I've spoken with small landlords who at least were able to come up with the money to join an apartment owners association of one sort or another, they were getting a pile of misinformation as well. So I have to question the quality of some of whatever. There are no landlords for small affordable housing providers to be able to gather information and get their questions answered and understand what's going on. So they have been without a voice, largely, it seems, in this process. Apologies for some background noise here. Let me also note that most of the assistance, the rental assistance programs, and Mr. Wong, I think you'd reference that, have up until this most recent state program, those rental assistance programs have been tenant driven. Landlords could only get their payments if tenants applied. So that's great if you have a great working relationship with your tenant. I also have found that most of the small housing providers I've talked to have good relationships with all their tenants except maybe one, or they had a good relation until the tenant couldn't pay anymore. And then the tenant, perhaps from shame, just stopped all communication. And so here, again, you have a horrible set of policy where assistance programs were structured exclusively reliant on tenants to apply in order for small housing providers to get the rent that they're owed. How would you all like to sit there for a year without your significant source of income? I know what would happen to me. I don't own property other than my little condo. I'd be foreclosed on. There's this notion out there that somehow magically the property owners can just go ahead and restructure their mortgage loan and just have it all put at the back end of the mortgage. That's ridiculous. That is not how it works. These are predominantly commercial property loans. You don't get that kind of friendly Fannie and Freddie government-sponsored enterprise insured loans. You don't get that kind of a generosity, and frankly, with a huge amount of loan modification for single-family homeowners. And it still ain't easy, even when you have these great federal rules in place. And it is not automatic that you get assistance when you need it. So it is remarkable to me the lack of information, the lack, and I just think it's truly ignorant, honestly, on the part of policymakers to have made these decisions. And I guess I'll apologize to them individually afterward when I hear back about how vigorously I have put this. But this is a big fat deal. This is our affordable housing rental stock that the state and counties and cities have endangered. Let me also note that there is a racial and gender wealth gap in America. So if you're going to talk out, if we're going to talk on from one perspective about equity and equality, but then and how safe real estate is, relatively speaking, as a little small fry to build wealth for your families, to put your kids through college. And then on the other hand, we're going to just pretend that if you own a rental property, you're suddenly wealthy. These are inconsistent notions.
So,
Just as with, I'm
no,
sorry, have I run out of time?
we need to wrap up. If you could just wrap up, I'm going to then go to the landlord.
Lovely. I will leave it at that, and I will try to respond to questions in the chat. Thank you for this opportunity.
That's wonderful. And thank you for the very powerful term of affordable housing providers. You've added an adjective to Ms. Wong's term. It's very helpful. Let's now go to Ji Wong, who is herself a small landlord. Ms. Wong, you're up next.
Okay. I'm not sure if my topic fit this your own topic or not, but actually my name is Ji Wang, and then I own 3 properties in Oakland. And then one is a duplex, and then another one is 50% with my brother, my family, and then that's the 5 units plus the 1 express Chinese restaurant. My brother who owned the restaurant, who run the restaurant, so currently it's still closed. And then the thing is that based on my experience, like my duplex, and then if 1 unit cannot pay the rent, which means I lost the 50% of the income. My whole family, the income is come from the real property. So currently, I think I understand the coronavirus hit everybody. Nobody can escape from this coronavirus. I think I have very good relationship with all my tenants. I try to help them. If I personally cannot get help from any organization or something, I try to give the tenant information about the rent payment. So I try to get a very good relationship with all my tenants. But one tendency is that he cannot pay me the rent. He feel guilty, and then he feel I really understand him. He decided to, at this point, he think it's time for him to move back to his own country, which is Guatemala. And then he gave his key to his friend, like his friend to give to me. But instead of his friend to give to me, he living in the property until today, from the last year. So which is dramatically loss of the rental property. And then I went to court last year. Unfortunately, the court was closed. So I couldn't do anything. Instead of cannot do anything at all. I'm kind of frustrated, and also I have the other tenant too. Seems like based on my experience, I'm the very small landlord, and then based on my experience, the duplex is 50% of the rent loss. And then I have another unit is like a little bit bigger. That's the biggest apartment complex, which I have the 16, which is also 20% rent loss. So I think based on the historical coronavirus impact, nobody can escape from this dramatically impact. So based on this situation, and then I really think if the court law system is still functioning, and then will be great. As long as the law, we can still, like the tenant, I have no idea the person who living in my property, he belong to my tenant. I have no idea. I never receive even penny from this tenant. And then I cannot do anything but him. The policeman come into my property, and then he said that he living there for a couple of months, which nobody knows who he is. So situation like this, and then if I can still evict a tenant, and then I think that's very important for me. So I think and also I noticed another thing that the coronavirus not only influenced the tenant like me, and then also seems like the people move from the city to outside to the suburb because of the people, the work schedule or work style is changed dramatically. The people don't go to the office anymore. They stay in home. So in the city, and then not more people interested in my home anymore. So my survive strategy is that, like Mr. Brown said, that I'm not only open to everybody, open to the low income rent with the federal government and no organizations help to pay me the rent. And then I think no, doesn't matter in one way or another, as long as I can survive, I will receive all the tools and to help me and survive this very difficult situation. That's what my experience.
Ms. Wong, thank you for your very eloquent testimony. I know that our media will like to follow up with interviews, possibly with you and several other landlords who either because they felt they couldn't have their names used or were otherwise unable to go on Zoom, but there are a number of landlords willing to share their stories with our reporters who were on this call. We have a number of questions now in the chat. Jessica, if I call out the reporter, can you possibly ask them to ask their question?
Yes.
First question from Mark and Zora, sorry if I'm mispronouncing, who asks about a moratorium on rent hikes. Mark, you have several questions. Do you want to ask that and your second question?
I'm asking to unmute him. I don't know. I don't think it's unmuting. Oh,
Yeah, I don't think it works. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can. Yeah. Well, is there a moratorium on rent hikes? That was one question. And then I think maybe the next one, especially given what we've heard about lack of knowledge about these programs, is how does one access those programs?
So who would
Well, I can address the question regarding moratoriums on rent increases. San Francisco had one from the beginning of COVID. I think Mayor London Breed had passed some emergency legislation, and the Board of Supervisors had supported that emergency legislations. And it had been actually moved forward twice till you couldn't raise rents until October 31st of 2020. There was no further extension on that, so that should a housing provider choose to, they can now. Statewide, I don't recall there being such a restriction, but there is an anti-gouging restriction. You cannot raise it by more than 10%. But I candidly, if I think that a housing provider should be cautious of raising a rent when people can't pay at all, because you want to at some point have a appropriate way to negotiate recapturing some of those funds, whether through a state program. I also might mention, it was mentioned a couple of times, that I didn't mention this during my presentation. Senate Bill 91 and the program is generally designed so that the funds go directly to the housing provider. And so it would be the housing provider who makes the application with some evidence that their tenant occupants are either 50% of area median or 80%, et cetera. So that is designed to go directly to. The trade-off is that the amount that one can get is 80% of the rent owed. And that housing provider makes the business decision, they're comfortable with that, and they forgive and waive the other 20%. So.
Okay, Maeva Brown, you wanted to add to the question.
Yes, briefly. Rent control jurisdictions actually do have rent caps, and so you would want to look to each jurisdiction for only on the rent controlled property. So for example, in the city of Oakland, the pandemic maximum is currently 2 points controlled. So for each rent controlled jurisdiction, you want to look to that. I also think it's really striking that even our statewide program, which is the first time a landlord will have the opportunity to apply directly, still requires that the landlord provide income information for the tenant. The tenant is still a critical part of the component of the equation. To me, that policymakers don't care how bad off the landlord is. It's not enough that the landlord's own small or difficult situation is driving them to request the assistance.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from Henrietta Burrows. Jessica, can you unmute Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Sandy. This is for Mr. Wong, my first question. Maybe not, it's from Ms. Choi. I was surprised to find that the data in terms of API landlords seems to be less significant. With one recent recession, it was thought that money from overseas, specifically money from China, people were using to buy up properties. So is it just a stereotype to think that there would be fewer API landlords than Black and Latino landlords? I thought that those with cash buying up properties came primarily from China. So then there would be more Asian landlords than others. Is that a stereotype?
I think that's probably true in California, but in national-wide, the number is still lower. The share of Asians landlords were about 67% and still is smaller than Black and Hispanic landlords. But I think definitely if we kind of look at different regions, especially in California, you'll see a greater share of Asian landlords. Unfortunately, in this data set, the sample's too small. So I wanted to show like race and ethnicity comparison within California, but then it was really difficult to break up the data.
And I'd like to maybe augment that a little bit also. I think one of the challenges is that, and this is maybe a stereotype to say this, but I think there is evidence that there's validity, that individuals of AAPI heritage tend to be more resistant to responding to surveys for a variety of fears. I know that my parents had that because of immigration situations. So that when you don't have the data, it's hard to gather it. And regarding the number of folks who were buying all cash from Asian countries and for a number of years, particularly China, a number of those units never went on to the rental market. They literally just held many of the units as assets that they would use once in a while. At least that's my personal experience with clients. So I think a lot of the AAPI landlords would be, as I described it, folks who maybe purchased a second property, didn't have to sell the first one, and then kind of moved into being a housing provider. And as many who are folks from the US as folks from offshore.
Thank you. We also have a number of questions from Shistri Prabha. Do you want to ask a question, Shristi?
Hi, I believe Jung answered a few of them, but I was just wondering if there was any data with respect to language barriers and whether or not that limited the access to information, because it seems like AAPI data was so significantly smaller. So yeah, that was just my question. I think you kind of answered it.
I would like to ask a question of Ms. Brown and a question of G. Wong. Meva, you mentioned that the policy towards landlords didn't distinguish between small landlords and large landlords. What is the ask we could make if we were writing about this and trying to line up interviews with policymakers? Can you break it down a little more clearly?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it would be fun to ask policymakers whether they know any of the data that has been presented here today. I would ask them, do you know how many of your, as a starting place, how many of your, what the percentage is of small landlords in our state? I think but I'm just thinking about the interviewing process because I think that they don't even realize how little that they really know. My ask would be that there be a completely separate track for support for small
we need you to.
Am I breaking up?
Yes. Can you just repeat that last sentence?
I would ask for a separate track for landlord assistance and a track that acknowledges that many of these small landlords are our affordable rental housing universe. That track would support maybe from Cal HFA for property repairs and possible refinance loans for affordability, but also an ongoing opportunity for small landlords to be able to apply for rental assistance, even post-pandemic.
Okay, and a quick question from Cherie Moreno. Who is responsible for disseminating information on the benefits? Maybe John, you could speak to that, John Wong.
Yeah, the state of California and the Housing and Community Development Agency is supposed to put on. In fact, my understanding, because we had pushed very hard for, is that it would be disseminating information in a variety of languages, and to work with entities like institutions of spirituality, like Korean churches, etc., or temples, to sort of disseminate information about this, because there is recognition that if there's English is not the primary language, the funds may be gone before they even are aware of how to apply. So that ARIA is working actively through our chapters in California to disseminate this information. I will comment also, I recognize that it could be intrusive for a small housing provider to ask their tenants for all their information, their income. I think there was some hope that as you're qualifying it for the rental application, would have some of that. But I think that was a response, and I am supportive of it, is to trying to get the funds to where it's more needed, rather than letting the folks who have the knowledge and resource, because then not actually need the money quite as badly, get it first. So
Right.
we're kind of learning as we go. This is what happened with the pandemic has changed our thinking in general.
Right. Well, finally, I want to ask Ms. Wong, what would you most hope to see happen that would in a way relieve you of some of these pressures caused by the pandemic and the lack of rental, being able to rely on secure rent and having your restaurant shuttered? You've been hit from both sides. What would you most want to see happen as we look forward to finally coming out of the worst part of the pandemic?
Currently, I don't think I cannot think about any new idea or something you guys can help us. But one thing that I think we need to adapt the post coronavirus impact, the trend, the whole society, they move along, and then I think totally different from the before the coronavirus. The reason because of the lots of things has been changed. For example, like workflow, and then not many people working in the city anymore. They're working in the office. That the office moved to the home, and then these people cannot be back to the city. So I'm really uncertainty what will happen after the coronavirus. But one thing that, for example, I have very high interest rate to pay the mortgage. If the bank can like to work with me to lower down my interest a little bit, I really appreciate it. But I think that's probably impossible. So things like this, and then I have no idea what to do.
Well, on that note,
another thing that I talked to several other landlords, and then the reason, for example, like Oakland, the rent we have been dropped 20%, but people doesn't like to drop even more. The reason because they said they can give free people the rent to move in, like 2 months free, even longer, but they don't want to drop the rent anymore. I asked the reason because they said that because of the rental control. As long as you drop the rent too low, you never can get back anymore. So that's the reason they rather give the 2 months free rent, 2 months rent free, but not like to drop the price too much. The only thing because of rental control, that's number one. And then number two, I forgot what I want to say, sorry. Well, I remember, okay.
okay.
And Sandy, can I make one last comment? I think there was a question asked, and the website is housing.ca.gov to apply for the assistance. HOUS, housing.ca.gov. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, well, I want to thank all of you who spoke today. To reporters like myself, you really opened a window on an area while we have explored evictions, and in fact, haven't done enough to explore evictions. This was really a new area for us, and it's obviously a very crucial part of the affordable housing picture. And I think the term affordable housing provider, we will think of landlords now less. And I think, John, you made this point. If you use the word landlord, it almost creates an adversarial framework. It's a landlord and then it's a tenant. We think of it in adversarial terms. This briefing has suggested it's way more complicated, and that in fact, these are the backbone of affordable housing providers. And we need to be conscious of the challenges and struggles these folks are grappling with, not only during the pandemic, but as Ms. Wong says, the uncertainty of post-pandemic life is going to be a real challenge for these people. I want to thank the reporters who joined us, and Ms. Choi, I think there's a tremendous interest in the data you are assembling, and we look forward for this being a first step and continuing this focus as we move forward in trying to do a better job reporting on affordable housing. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.